my perspective on that, positive or negative, is certainly taken into account by the foreign minister.
What was your understanding of why Zhao Wei was being PNG'd?
Three things. First of all, over the past number of years leading up to this, there have been increasing instances of foreign interference by China and increasing moments of Canadian officials informing China directly that their interference activities were unacceptable and needed to stop, needed to decrease, they needed to stop attempting to interfere in Canadians' lives and in our institutions. That perhaps had its most clear moment in the G20 meeting in Indonesia, where I directly informed Premier Xi that he needed to make sure that China ceased interfering into Canada, into Canadian democracy. It wasn't a conversation that went particularly well, but it was a conversation that needed to be had and that we had. However, despite that and many other messages to China, the interference continued and even in some cases increased. So that was part of the reason why we needed to make sure there was a clear consequence. Secondly, as we looked into it, as the allegations around Michael Chong were surfaced publicly, on digging into it with the Foreign Affairs Ministry here in Canada, it was clear that even though in the case of Michael Chong, Zhao Wei was not engaged in interference so much as influence, that is, regular diplomatic collection of information with the goal of sanctioning, for example. So in the case of Michael Chong, not direct interference in the analysis of our intelligence agencies, but in other cases had been involved in interference activities. We realized that that was a reason to look at kicking him out of the country, that he was involved and known to be involved in foreign interference, even if it wasn't directly in the case of Michael Chong. And third, the fact that there needed to be consequences for China. He'd been involved in foreign interference activities. And third, it had been made public, meant that he was also not going to be able to operate as a regular diplomat in Canada anymore. His utility as a diplomat to both Canada and I guess to China had ended because he was so clearly outed in the media as being a bad actor. Those three things together meant that to give a consequence to China, to give consequences on foreign interference, and specifically the fact that he was not going to be much use as a diplomat anymore, we chose to kick him out of the country.
Okay. I'm going to move now.
And actually, I think we asked China to remove him from the country first, and when they didn't, we said, okay, well, then we're going to have to kick him out.
Okay, so one last chance, and then he was gone. We'll move now to another event that led to the PNGing of a diplomat, this time an Indian diplomat, which is the murder of Hardeep Singh Najjar. I'll ask the court registrar to pull up WIT 106, please. So there's a few things to talk about in this, and if we can scroll down to paragraphs 52 to 55, please. There we go. So the first question I'll ask you to take us through, Prime Minister, is what led to your announcement in the House of Commons in September 2023?
Over the course of the summer, I was apprised by my intelligence services that there was credible intelligence that agents of the government of India were involved in the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. This is something that we had actually asked the intelligence agencies to look into, because following the rather high-profile killing months before, the initial assessment was, oh, this was gang-related or criminal-related. There was not an obvious, immediate international nexus to this. And that's how we were briefed after the meeting, after the killing in the days afterwards. However, hearing directly from a number of our South Asian members of parliament and seeing and talking with members of the South Asian community around who were quite insistent that it was something that was likely connected to government of India, we actually asked the intelligence agencies, and it turned out they were doing this anyway, to look in more closely to the circumstances around this particular murder. So in late July, early August, I was briefed on the fact that there was intelligence from Canada and possibly from Five Eyes allies that made it fairly clear, incredibly clear, that India was involved in this killing. Agents of the government of India were involved in the killing of a Canadian on Canadian soil. This was something that we obviously had to take extremely seriously. That violation of sovereignty, of the international rule of law, with extrajudicial killing in a foreign country, in a fellow democracy, was a massive mistake if India had indeed done it, and we had reasons to believe that they had. So our immediate approach was to engage with the government of India to say, and we had our various security officials reach out to India and say, look, there are real concerns that your security agencies were involved in the killing of Nijjar. We need to work on this together because that can't stand. We need to make sure that there are changes and there's accountability for this process, but let's try and do it in a responsible way that doesn't come and blow up the relationship between Canada and India. And that was the attempts we made in the month of August. As we approached the end of August and September, the big thing that was happening was India was itself hosting the leader of the summit of the advanced economies of the world, the G20. So it was a big moment for India, welcoming the world, all the leaders of the world to Delhi for a very important summit. And we had the opportunity of making it a very uncomfortable summit for India if we went public with these allegations ahead of time. We chose not to. We chose to continue to work behind the scenes to try and get India to cooperate with us. Their asks of us was, well, how much do you know? Give us the evidence you have on this. And our response was, well, it's within your security agencies. You should be looking into how much they know. You should be engaging. It's, oh, no, tell us what you know. Show us the evidence. And at that point, it was primarily intelligence, not hard evidentiary proof. So we said, well, let's work together and look into your security services and maybe we can get that done. No, we're not doing that. It culminated with a conversation I had with Prime Minister Modi on after the end of the last session at the G20 in Delhi, where I sat down and shared that we knew that they were involved and expressed a real concern around it. He responded with the usual response from him, which is that we have people who are outspoken against the Indian government living in Canada that he would like to see arrested. And I tried to explain that freedom of speech and freedom of people who come to our country to be Canadians to criticize governments overseas is, or indeed to criticize the Canadian government, is a fundamental freedom of Canada. But as always, we would work with them on any evidence or any concerns they have around terrorism or incitement to hate or anything that is patently unacceptable in Canada. And we have taken action in the past. We continue to take action. Even as I emphasize, and I have emphasized regularly, my position and Canada's position is to defend the territorial integrity of India. One India is official Canadian policy. And the fact that there are a number of people in Canada who advocate otherwise does not make it Canadian policy, but also does not make it, is not something that is illegal in Canada. Having done all that, we returned to Canada, and it was obvious that the Indian government response, particularly through the media, was to instead attack Canada, to attack Canadians, to criticize us, to undermine our government and our governance, and quite frankly, the integrity of our democracy. Combined with the fact that as we approached the end of September, it looked like there was going to be media stories detailing some of these allegations that were getting out there. When on the first day that the House returned, we determined that it was in the interest of public safety in Canada to let people know that we knew about these allegations, that we were following up on them. There was an investigation into them that was taken on by police services in Canada to ensure that, partially to ensure that nobody in Canada, in any communities, felt like they needed to take action themselves, that they should trust Canadian institutions to take this threat seriously and follow up on it. And that's exactly what we then did. We launched investigations. The Indian response to these allegations and to our investigations was to double down on attacks against this government, attacks against this government's integrity, attacks against Canada in general, but also to arbitrarily eject dozens of diplomats from Canada, from Canadian diplomats from India, on absolutely no cause other than to say, well, we don't like what you said in the House about us, and we're going to punish you for that. This was a situation in which we had clear, and certainly now even clearer, indications that India had violated Canada's sovereignty, and their response was to double down and attack Canada further, rather than take responsibility or say, how can we fix this? Yes, this was a violation of the rule of law, and even take any of the many off-ramps we offered, because we don't want to be in this situation of picking a fight with a significant trading partner with whom we have deep people-to-people ties and a long history, and our fellow democracies. But standing up unequivocally for Canadian sovereignty and for the safety of Canadians back then was essential, and absolutely led to the very, very clear pronouncements we made earlier this week that the RCMP, the conclusions and the evidence that the RCMP determined in terms of violence towards Canadians that has been enabled by and directed by, in many cases, the Indian government.
So you've made reference to the allegations that were the announcement of the RCMP earlier this week, and we know that that wasn't solely connected to the Najjar investigation per se. It's a broader thing than that, and it involves allegations of interference by India in promotion of violent extremism, tying agents of the government of India to homicides, violent acts, the use of organized crime, and interference into democratic processes. So it's a much wider thing. And we know that it led to, over the past weekend, the PNGing of 6 Indian diplomats. What can you say? And you mentioned before that the hope was not to blow up the relationship.
Okay, so we've got big news coming out of Canada this week. Headlines are blowing up over Canada, kicking out Indian diplomats. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
What would even cause that kind of dramatic reaction? That's what we're going to dig into today. We've got our hands on some really fascinating interview transcripts, and they're giving us like this inside look at everything going on. It's like we're getting to listen in on Justin Trudeau's thinking as this whole thing unfolds.
And it's important to remember, like, expelling diplomats, that's not, just some everyday thing in international relations. It's a really big deal. Like, this is a sign of a big breakdown diplomatically. There's always a lot more going on than we see in the headlines.
Totally. And to like really understand what's going on here, we have to rewind a bit. Because this whole thing with India, it didn't come out of nowhere. These transcripts actually mentioned 2 expulsions. Remember that whole thing with the Chinese diplomat earlier this year?
Right. And that's key here. It shows us there's a pattern here, like a deliberate approach from Canada. They're drawing a hard line confronting what they're calling foreign interference.
So let's start with the Chinese diplomat case. What's Trudeau's take on this?
Well, he makes it clear that this wasn't just a one-time thing, a reaction to some small incident. He's saying straight up that there's a pattern of China interfering in Canada's business.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The transcript says that Trudeau actually confronted Xi Jinping about all of this at the G20. Could you imagine being there for that? That must have been so tense.
Oh, yeah, totally. So what made Trudeau do this? Like, confront another world leader on a stage like that? Well, Trudeau says that they warned China multiple times, that China just kept doing whatever they wanted. They just wouldn't stop. So Canada had to do something.
And now you start to see the bigger picture. A lot of other countries are struggling with how to deal with China's ambitions. They're trying to figure out how to respond when China tries to exert its influence. This is about way more than just Canada and China now. Right. Okay, so that's China. Now we've got this other situation with India, which escalates really quickly. It starts with a murder. Hardeep Singh Nijjar is killed. And at first it seems like just a local crime. And then suddenly it blows up into an international incident.
And here's where things get really wild. Trudeau just comes right out and says it in these transcripts. He says Canadian intelligence believes that Indian government agents were involved in this killing, and it happened on Canadian soil. I mean, that's a huge accusation.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. We're talking about one country accusing another of basically carrying out an assassination. This isn't a movie. This is really happening.
It is. And to make things even more complicated, this wasn't something that Canada just came out and said. The transcripts show that Canada actually tried to deal with this quietly at first.
And yeah, they tried to use back channels to talk to India and see if they could figure out a solution.
Yeah.
They wanted to avoid making this whole thing a diplomatic nightmare. You could just imagine all those diplomats scrambling around behind the scenes. Oh yeah, for sure. And this is all happening right before India is supposed to host the G20 summit. Talk about awkward timing.
Right. Can you imagine the pressure? But even with this huge event coming up, Trudeau decides he can't keep quiet. He has that really tense conversation with Modi. And get this, he actually confronts Modi about how he deals with people who disagree with him.
Yeah, hold on. Let's break that down a little because that's where things get really interesting. What exactly is Trudeau pushing back against?
Okay, so the transcripts say that Modi was basically telling Canada to shut down Sikh activists, people in Canada who were speaking out against the Indian government. And that's where you see this clash of values that Trudeau keeps talking about.
Right. Freedom of speech. Like that's a core Canadian value. It's like he's telling Modi, look, we can't just silence people here because they're criticizing a foreign government.
Exactly. And it's such a tough situation. How do you balance national security with those core democratic values? That's something a lot of countries struggle with. But going back to the story, so instead of trying to find some common ground, India goes on the attack. It's like a full-on PR campaign, accusations everywhere. They're trying to make Canada look bad and undermine their whole system of government.
Wow. So much for keeping things under wraps. What was the final straw? What made Canada finally say, enough is enough?
Well, Trudeau says it was a few things. First, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they come out and say they found solid evidence linking India to violence and extremism in Canada. Not just the Niger case, but potentially other stuff too. And then on top of that, India kicks out Canadian diplomats. It's like retaliation for even looking into what happened.
So basically, India is saying, mind your own business.
Exactly. And that's where those 6 Indian diplomats in Canada come in. Kicking out diplomats, that's a last resort. It means the relationship is so bad that normal diplomacy just isn't working anymore.
Right. So now we have this huge standoff. Everyone's pointing fingers. Diplomats are getting kicked out left and right. And no one's backing down.
And this is where it gets really interesting from like a global politics perspective, because Trudeau keeps bringing up this rules-based international order. It's this idea that countries have to follow the rules, talk to each other in good faith, and respect each other's sovereignty.
Which is exactly what Trudeau's saying India isn't doing.
Exactly. And it's not just an academic debate. This is happening in the real world with real consequences. So the big question is, what do you do when a country decides the rules don't apply to them? What can other countries actually do about it?
It's almost like this whole situation throws out the rule book.
It kind of does. It makes us think about some really tough questions. This isn't just about Canada and India anymore. It shows us how fragile things are in the world. It shows how easily those diplomatic rules can fall apart.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, like, what does this mean for the world? Are we going to see more of these diplomatic showdowns?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's something that leaders everywhere are thinking about. This whole thing with Canada, it's like a warning. It shows what happens when diplomacy fails, especially when you're dealing with countries that want to make their own rules.
It's definitely been eye-opening. So where do we go from here? What are the big takeaways for our listeners?
Well, the most important thing is to understand what's really going on in the world. We can't just focus on the headlines. We have to look deeper. Try to figure out why things are happening. Look at the history and think about what might happen next.
Right. Knowing what's going on is so important, especially with such complicated situations.
It really is. And I'd ask your listeners to think about this. What if you were Trudeau? How would you handle this whole thing? What would be the most important thing to you? What would you do to try and fix it?
It's like a real-life strategy game.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that this isn't just some theoretical stuff. It has real consequences. It affects everything from global trade to the safety of everyday people.
Exactly. And it shows us how important it is to talk to each other, to question what we think we know, and to try to see things from other people's perspectives.
This deep dive has been like a crash course in global politics. We've broken down the events, we've looked at why things happened, and we've explored the possible outcomes. But most importantly, we've given you, our listeners, the information you need to form your own opinions. So keep asking questions, stay informed, and remember how important it is to understand the world around us.